Hello, my name's Stuart. I'm curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon. Thanks very much indeed for joining us for another of our YouTube videos. This time round, I'm just here briefly to introduce an interview I did the other day with Dr. Jonathan Healey. Jonathan is from the University of Oxford and has just published his new, and I suspect best-selling, history of the 17th century in England called The Burning World, which is hugely recommended. A very entertaining and very engaging look at this hugely important period of history. And of course, the period of Cromwell and the Civil Wars features prominently within that. It was a really great interview and a really great chat with Jonathan for some 45 minutes. Hope you enjoy. Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you very much for a chat, and congratulations on the new book, of which my pristine copy just here. I was going to say, you must be doing the round of all of these at the moment. You seem to be popping up on Radio 4, on podcasts and all sorts of things. So everybody seems to be sort of delighted by what you've produced.
Well, yeah, Radio 4. Okay, that's I did Radio 3, but
Radio 3, that's it. Yeah,
no,
Free Thinking the other day.
I don't think I quite cracked the kind of heights of Radio 4, but yeah, it's been great. I've done a few events, and it's been really nice to see how much enthusiasm there is for this period, because in the sort of wider historical community, the Tudor period has always kind of slightly overshadowed our period in the 17th century, which of course is not true with sort of academic historians. The civil wars and the 17th century have been the one of the kind of great kind of testing grounds for sort of great theories of history and everything like that. But it's never quite had quite the same kind of cut through. But it has been really nice to see people just generally genuinely enthusiastic about a really fascinating period of history.
It's one of the things we talk about a lot when we do these sorts of things, is actually, why is the 17th century not better known? Why is it always the endless books or TV documentaries on the Tudors or on Nazis or whatever? And actually, it seems to be getting cut through at the moment. Your book seems to be the latest of a series of books, Anna Keyes and Jessie Childs's work and Rod Hutton's and all the rest of it that seem to be getting an awful lot of attention. So the 17th century seems to be getting its sort of day in the sun. Kind of, why do you think this is?
It's a great question. So when I wrote The Blazing World, I was very, very adamant that it was not a Brexit book. It's not about and I was and there's quite a sort of a very sort of generous review in the Financial Times which came out yesterday by Jerry Broughton, who basically kind of talks about it as if it's kind of in the shadow of this great event that's taken place in the last few years. So obviously the my attempt to write a non-Brexit book about the 17th century has failed. but that, be that as it may, I think, we are living through quite uncertain times. There have been political decisions taken recently which have shocked quite a lot of people and have made the future quite uncertain. And I think in that context, I think trying to kind of look at previous periods where that sort of there's kind of difficult and surprising and potentially quite dangerous decisions have been taken, and then we have to work through the repercussions of it. I think there's a kind of there's a sort of rhyme there, if you like. One of these moments where history doesn't repeat but it rhymes.
Resonances, isn't there?
Yeah, resonances. Words like the prorogation of Parliament were words which were completely second nature to specialists on the 17th century and those of us who've worked through what happens in the 1620s, for example, and largely forgotten by the political nation until Boris Johnson. And I think trying to understand the history behind that relationship between the government and Parliament, and of course what's going on outside Parliament. One of the great things about the 17th century, one of the fascinating things about the 17th century, is so much and one of the things I really kind of try and drive home in this book is so much of the politics goes on out of doors, and it's it's people outside Westminster, it's people outside Whitehall, petitioning, reading newspapers, discussing things in ale houses and eventually coffee houses, and putting pressure on the government from outside. And we did see a huge resurgence of that in the post referendum, and that I think was as much as as much as I did try and write a very much a non-Brexity book, and I was my heart rather sank when I read the most recent review of it. But it was a book written with the kind of rhythms of extra parliamentary petitioning and public protest going on in the background. And I think my reading of the 1640s, for example, is probably partly conditioned by that.
Is it sort of, because obviously there are all sorts of resonances of the 17th century, we've just been through a pandemic, that sounds very familiar. But also as well, does the 17th century raise all sorts of issues that perhaps we're still trying to address with today? The 1640s and that major upheaval, for example, raised questions about the nature of freedom and democracy and monarchy and religious toleration and the role of women and freedom of the press, and all things actually that seem horribly familiar today. It's sort of things we're still wrestling with in 2023.
Yeah, one of the analogies that I think it kind of works better than some of the others is that we are when we think about our current relationship with social media and the internet, we are going through a sort of maturing, a sort of second phase of the relationship between the internet and political discourse. And in a way, the 17th century was sort of similar in that regard, in that print goes back in Europe and to the late 15th century, and so it's not new, it's not especially new in this period, but what is new is there are new forms of print. There's new forms of printed cartoons, for example. Woodcuts become much more common. There's more sophisticated forms of print. Most importantly, of course, there's newspapers. So there's the periodization of news. So you might go, for example, to an ale house or a street corner, and you might buy a newspaper that you know and trust because you identify with the ideology that you've seen in this newspaper before. You might identify yourself as a Mercurius Orlicus reader, i.e. a royalist, and that kind of relationship with print is something that is new in the 17th century and actually has quite a significant impact on the way people think about political discourse. And in a way, we're kind of grappling with similar sort of things with the internet. And the early days of the internet, there was email and news sites and everything like that, and it was in many ways it was trying to replicate the offline world but in an online context. And then in the first decade of the 21st century, with the advent of social media, you got a real change to that, and I think politically we're still kind of working through the implications there. So I think there are some kind of analogies, but I would say that, and I realize I'm preaching entirely to the converted here, the 17th century is a fascinating period in and of its own right. And, in some ways, what's quite nice about it, to write about it, is that you are able to kind of throw yourself into this very, very complex, very rich world full of really interesting, if entirely problematic characters, and you are able to just sort of think, well, look how different it was. Look how these intelligent, schooled people, men, women, and children, look at how they saw the world and how they saw the world in very different ways to the way that we do. To a certain extent, one of the things that's great is that you have got a profoundly sort of conservative culture in this period, and yet so many people find lots and lots of ways of challenging that, and that for me is what makes it so fascinating. There's this sort of great explosion in sort of challenging views of the world, of the universe, of society, of gender relations, of everything, and that's just in itself in and of itself, it's a great period to write about and to read about, I hope.
Absolutely. And you've chosen the kind of the whole of the 17th century, which is really interesting because historians seem to have got increasingly, in academic history, certainly increasingly specialist, and it's sort of, drilling down to sort of very, very sort of defined periods, or even not only defined periods, but around factors. And you've gone for the whole period with a narrative history that seems to mix both the social and political together in a kind of much more holistic view of history, which if somebody comes from a museum world, I find, really exciting, and much more the way that we're used to putting across history, which is, so what sort of persuaded you to go down that kind of route rather than the way the majority of the profession or historiography has been doing for the last 20 years or so?
I mean, that's a great question, and I come at this as someone who's written one of the academic articles I wrote was on a single fight in 1535, and I partly do come at it from the sort of historical tradition as well, but I think. I mean, I had a slight frustration with the existing literature on this period, in that there is, I mean, there is great stuff, and it is incredibly well served by serious historians, and there are solid academic textbooks. There's stuff like Mark Kishlansky's book, which is quite nice and readable if a little bit old. There's stuff like Barry Coward's book, which is very serviceable for students, but there's nothing really which takes the whole period, unless you're looking back towards stuff like Christopher Hill's Century of Revolution, or those kind of things. There's nothing that takes the whole period and just says to a general audience, not to an audience of students who have just landed in university and have to mug up on this kind of really complicated century, which is what some of those textbooks are aimed at. There's not really anything which says to them, look at this fascinating period, here is a guide to what happened, and why we think it's important. And I think there are some really good books which do that for other periods, I was just I felt that there was a bit of a gap for the 17th century. I mean, again, I think there are some really, really good books on specific periods. I like Mike Braddock's book on the Civil War. I think that's really nice and clear. Once you get into the more specific periods, you've got stuff like Veronica Wedgwood's stuff, which is still so beautifully
brilliant
written.
stuff.
It's very old, but still so evocative. But there wasn't really anything that kind of took the whole period. And the only things that did were very much from the perspective of high politics. And you take that book by Kishlansky, for example, and he basically says in the start, he says, look, do you know what, I'm just not going to do social history, it's just not my thing. If you want social history, then get another book. Great, there's some great stuff on social history of the period. You've got Keith Wrightson, Jim Sharp, all these people writing brilliant social history. But what I was trying to do was to really kind of integrate the two and think about, what are the political developments, but how do they intermesh with social and economic developments? The early part of the period, for example, you've got this kind of great pressure on society caused by inflation, and that's one of the reasons that you get these kind of reformist movements, and that includes people like Charles I, who wants to reorganize society and do things like banning people from building in London. And then it includes Oliver Cromwell, who the government of the Republic, they are very, very keen on things like regulating alehouses, things like preventing unruly behavior, swearing, all these kind of things. And these are not things which just sort of pop in because it's the bugbear of particular politicians. And you probably find this with Cromwell. Everyone sort of said, well, Cromwell does all this stuff, he bans all these things, and obviously there's a whole thing there, but the whole Puritan thing about regulating society, that's not just the bugbear of a few kind of finicky bossy boots. That is something which has very deep roots in society. It goes back to the late Elizabethan period. It goes back to not just the Puritan movement, but with sort of social reform movements in local communities. And I wanted to sort of pull all that stuff together a little bit
I was going to ask you about that specifically because it is something you pick out a few times. I notice in the book about sort of there does seem to be a particular or a series of particular obsessions in the 17th century, not just the one everybody thinks of with the Puritans in the 1640s and 50s, but there seems to be a particular obsession with kind of enforcing moral bans on stuff. I wanted to ask you, where does this come from, and also, I mean, what do they think they're trying to achieve? Because bearing in mind the machinery of the 17th century in terms of the state, actually, none of these bans can actually have been terribly effective. There's no police force; they're pretty much unenforceable. They're almost like a kind of expression of disapproval in a way, really.
Yeah, I think that's true, and in order to enforce things, you have to have the buy-in from the local officers, and that was one of the other things I was quite keen to sort of talk about in that you think about politics and government in this period, and you think about, well, who are the MPs, who's in the government, who's on the Privy Council, but there's a huge sort of tradition of scholarship which really focuses on the local people. That's the men who are serving as overseers of the poor or constables, and it's the women who are serving as on sort of juries of matrons and witnesses in lawsuits. And there's that whole kind of deep texture of government and governance in this period, which I was really, really keen to bring out. But the question about why is it a period so obsessed with banning things? I think it's a really good question, because things that we don't sort of necessarily realize. This is the first century when drunkenness becomes a crime. And it's subject to a parliamentary statute in 1606. Swearing becomes a crime, not under Cromwell but under James I, who is himself a notoriously foul-mouthed, of course. And I think it's partly a sort of Renaissance thing. It's about it's a belief that the state can reform society. That's a very modern idea. In my previous life, I worked on the poor law, and this is a kind of an astonishing. If I call it an achievement, I'll be accused of being too Whiggish, but it is an astonishing achievement. By the end of the 17th century, every single parish has a responsibility for looking after the so-called deserving poor, and that it's not exactly, we're not talking a sort of modern welfare state, but it's a remarkable achievement. And I think that partly comes out of this sort of Renaissance idea that the state, the civitas, if you like, has a role in reforming society, and it's where this notion of social policy comes from, which is it's a sort of I suppose it's a characteristic of early modernity. But the other thing I'm trying to kind of really get across in this book is that particularly in the early 17th century, just society is just so much more fraught. One of the stats which I think I got from Steve Hindle, I think, as a lot of my good stuff comes from, which was that basically, if you look at hangings, fairly grim stuff, but there were more people hanged in England between 1580 and 1630 than there were between 1630 and the abolition of capital punishment in 1967, which is a remarkable statistic, because you think about the 18th century and all the
I was going to say the era of the bloody code.
Absolutely, and yet it's this early 17th century period where it seems that there's just quite a violent society, really, in lots and lots of ways. And I think that reflects the fact that society is just under a huge amount of pressure in this period. And that, for me, manifests itself partly in the political conflicts of the time. Because on the one hand, you've got people who are desperate to reform society and prevent people having illicit sex and getting drunk and all that kind of thing, and they sort of tend towards Puritanism. But on the other, you've got a more kind of royalist, a kind of what I would describe as a sort of slightly more kind of cavalier attitude, whereby you put more emphasis on neighborly good relations, but as part of that, you have a real kind of hankering for old hierarchies, and one of the attacks that the Cavaliers, the Royalists, use against their enemies, throughout the Civil War period, is that they're turning the world upside down. They are irreverent. They are Democrats. I one of the things that one of the points I make in the book, which I'm surprised hasn't caused me more trouble in the reviews, is that there's that whole thing. Well, the parliamentarians aren't fighting for democracy. No, they're not. But the Royalists are fighting against democracy. They see the parliamentarians as Democrats because they are irreverent towards established hierarchies, because they are supported by the sectaries, etc., etc. And I think I see that partly, at least, coming out of this kind of great period of social stress in the early 17th century.
Are there particular sort of concerns you think that you can see running throughout the 17th century for people? Sort of, your average man in the street, sort of, there are the things that sort of, I mean, you sort of, I know you've talked before about sort of, the people actually, a lot of their concerns are obviously still the same ones that we have today. They're still very much the same sorts of people as we are now, but things that actually people we might find quite alien. There's sort of this whole thing in the 17th century, quite a lot of people crave stability. There is the sort of the stable state, which, given everything that's happening, seems, very natural and understandable. And of course, obviously, there is the whole aspect of faith, which we would find, or in our very secular British 21st century society, again, find a lot of us would find quite alien.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the fascinating things about the period is that people get really worked up about things which to us seem quite sort of esoteric. And one of the most controversial things that the Long Parliament does is it sets up a committee for tables placed altarwise, which you wouldn't necessarily think is the kind of the stuff of stirring political drama, but it is. I think that the question about stability is really interesting, particularly from your perspective as a Cromwellian. One of the reasons that I think Cromwell is so successful, I'm sure you'll have views about this. One of the reasons I think he's so successful in creating a viable political entity after the regicide and after the Rump Parliament is that he is able to attract those kind of relatively conservative members of the rural gentry who basically want stability, and that's what he provides. And I think that sort of hankering for stability is then again it comes to play in 1660. I don't see the Restoration as being inevitable at all. It's probably the most likely outcome, probably, but I wouldn't necessarily see it as inevitable. And I think it sort of comes from a desire not for royal rule or anything like that, but for stability. And that stability it's not just about not having a new government every 2 minutes, which is what seems to be the case in 1653 or 1659, but also a sort of a local stability whereby there is a bit more control over these kind of fringe religious groups who I think are rather brilliant, and I think I really like foregrounding people like the Quakers because they're just so interesting, but at the time they were almost certainly, for the vast majority of people, quite frightening, and that sort of created a sort of real sort of conservative backlash, if you like. And Cromwell kind of rides some of that, I think. I think he's much more conservative than the popular imagination would have it.
Well, it's the old adage about him being a social conservative and a religious radical, which I think there's a lot of truth to. And I'd agree with your analysis in terms of, in a way, actually, he almost seems like the compromise candidate in a way, really. That's why he's able to establish it. Because, of course, I think one of the things, again, you try and kind of bring out a bit is that there is, nobody planned the Republic.
No.
There's no roadmap for this, is there? They're kind of making it up as they go along.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's Henry Martin, maybe. He's I sort of, I sort of imagine him
Well,
sitting there.
yeah, well, yes,
Yeah,
he's a strange one anyway, but yeah,
yes,
definitely.
yeah,
But
yeah. A wonderful character, but a strange one. And yet, I mean, I'm also quite keen uh to argue that although it is I mean, it is an accident. It does come out of quite deep lying ideological debates, and I don't really see the what happens in the 1640s as just being, a series of accidents, which
it's a series of logical conclusions to various to situations, isn't it, in a way, really, I suppose.
maybe I wouldn't quite go that far. I mean, there's definitely a role for contingency, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
What would have happened had.
Mm. Oh,
But
then we can get into counterfactuals and all sorts of things really interesting with that. Yeah.
yes, well, I do. There is one bit where I sort of imagine what would have happened if Thomas Rainbow had been the leader of the parliamentarian army, which is a very frivolous thing to imagine. But why not? Why not? Why not?
I mean, you've mentioned a number of people there. I mean, who are some of the characters that have really stood out to you as sort of, these pen portraits that you've had to pull out of these people here? Who are your sort of standout people that you kind of found really interesting to write about?
I mean, I really enjoyed writing about Margaret Cavendish, and she's one of these characters who, um, she's like one of those ink blot things, and everyone who looks at her can find different things.
She's that's where the title of the book comes from, isn't it?
Yes, yeah,
Quite,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. So it's sort of a homage to her science fiction, or sort of quasi science fiction book, A Discovery of a New World Called the Blazing World. And I find her really fascinating because, I mean, she's a sort of arch royalist, who, I mean, she's married to the Duke of Newcastle, who's of course, one of the King's General in the North until Marston Moor. Said to be much better at poetry than generalship, and she clearly got quite conservative views about a lot of things, and yet she is kind of imagining a much more a world with much more kind of female participation in the public sphere. So as with a lot of these people, she's quite radical in some ways, but quite conservative insofar as radicalism and conservatism are useful concepts in the period. So I enjoyed writing about her a lot. I actually enjoyed writing about Charles I quite a lot, because I think he's a fascinating character. I don't necessarily see him as this kind of kind of purely tyrannical figure. I think he is a victim of circumstances to a certain extent. I think there's a lot more. He's got a lot more kind of structural issues. That's not to say he doesn't make mistakes, and that's not to say that he doesn't have a fairly flagrant disregard for the lives of his subjects when he needs to. I think that in 1648, when he basically relaunches the Civil War, I can kind of get why people in the New Model Army were so angry about him. I do see that. There's another bit in 1641 when there's all these protests in London, and he basically him and Secretary Nicholas give the order, if need be, for the militia to come out and shoot protesters on the streets of London. I don't think we really quite grasp how unusual that is for the period. This is not something that rulers really did in this period. You don't shoot rioters as a general rule.
Because popular protest is much more common at that time.
It's much more common, and the authorities are more standoffish than you might expect. There's a lot more of an aversion, I think, to the shedding of blood than you would necessarily guess, from the way that the period is described. So I think actually that's quite a Rubicon actually for Charles, when and it's twice in 1641 and early 1642 there's these orders go out to sort of shoot protesters if necessary with bullets. So I think, I mean, he's, as I say, he's someone with a sort of fairly kind of a regrettable disregard for human life, in a way that other rulers from the period kind of have shared and have been rightly criticised for. And yet I don't necessarily sort of see him in 1625 sort of sitting there thinking, right, I'm going to destroy Parliament, and I'm going to rule as some kind of great Roman tyrant. I think there's a lot more he's a lot less kind of manipulative and planning that. I think he is kind of buffeted by the circumstances a little bit. But I find I still find all the kind of the 1640s, the New Model Army people, the levelers, all those kind of guys. I just find them just really interesting in the way that they were able to kind of imagine new worlds. And even someone like John Lambert, who I think is fascinating.
He's one of the kind of forgotten characters of the period, isn't he?
Absolutely. And not particularly kind of no Winstanley there. He's not a sort of he's not a George Fox or a Winstanley, and yet he in kind of writing down a written constitution, that in itself is a really interesting and unusual direction for the English constitution to take, because we've decided in our wisdom as a nation that that's not something that we are going to stick with, and we have this kind of unwritten or at least uncodified constitution, and what that allows him to do is it allows him to set down basic fundamental freedoms, which is something which most countries around the world have, but in England for reasons that are rather complicated, we don't. So all these people, and I think the kind of the take home really is that you have a century in which quite a lot of quite ordinary men and women are doing really quite remarkable things, and that for me is what makes it so exciting and so fascinating.
Just for anybody watching, by the way, if you want to see an original copy of the Instrument of Government, John Lambert's handiwork, we've actually got a copy on display in the Cromwell Museum, so come and have a look. Just, I suppose, interestingly, because you obviously pick up on this very tumultuous period in the middle of the century. I remember, I think it was during COVID, you and I got into a whole discussion on Twitter at one point, which was about what do we call this period? Is it the Great Rebellion? Is it the English Civil War? Is it the English Revolution? Now, having written this book, have you come to a decision yet?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. And of course, a very legitimate kind of response to my work in particular is, we can't just think about England. We've got the whole archipelago, and I think the idea that it is the one very kind of popular term these days is the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which I think does capture the complexity of what's going on.
It does always, but always, we find from a public engagement point of view, the problem with that is that people look at you blankly or assume you're talking about something from Game of Thrones. So,
and then you've got sort of, I quite like sort of Austin Woolrich, Britain in Revolution, but then of course where does Ireland fit in there? The mid 17th century civil wars, it doesn't have quite the zing to it. I do like the R word. That's one thing that I think is quite important to my book, is that although obviously, and I acknowledge this in the end, in the 17th century you had a very different view of what a revolution was. It was about a sort of a resetting, a recycling of cycling back of politics, but I think the establishment of the idea that the king is not above the law, it may seem a bit esoteric to us today, but it's a very, very important constitutional principle, and it took a civil war and essentially an army coup, if you like, to establish that, and that for me is revolutionary. So I do think the word revolution is quite important. And then, and you know, you can talk about the Scottish Revolution as well in 1637-38. What happens in Scotland is incredibly you know, radical and revolutionary, and they basically kind of overthrow the monarchy and they create this sort of parliamentary government. They do lots of this stuff before the English, of course. But I think you know, I think the R word is probably quite important. I don't really buy into the sort of Great Rebellion stuff.
No, I mean that always strikes me as being sort of post-restoration sort of
Yeah.
name for it or whatever. But yeah, I mean the revolution one or whatever, I think it's always interesting that, you know, a century later the Americans look back to this period during their revolution and they talk about you know, the learning lessons from what happened in England, and likewise the French do 20 years later with their revolution. So if they regarded with their revolutions England as having a revolution, who are we to kind of quibble with that in a way, really? So
No, absolutely, and
if
of course,
other
yeah,
revolutionaries thought it was a revolution,
yeah,
then kind of, you know,
yeah.
that's as good as an argument as anybody.
Yeah, you know, Lenin did. You know, in that kind of early 20th century Marxist tradition, it was the first bourgeois revolution. You know, I don't think that's I mean, that's not really stood up to scrutiny. All having said that, one of the things that I do emphasize quite a bit in this book, which is, you know, possibly one of the more controversial approaches that I take, which is that in the, you know, in the 16th century, you get this kind of, I talk about the rise of the middling sort.
Yes, I noticed your middling sorts term. Yeah,
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, you know, and these are kind of people like Cromwell, I suppose. And you know, they're more literate, they have more books, they are more likely to be involved in the running of government through office holding. Their sons and daughters will move to London. They are involved in lawsuits, and if you're involved in lawsuits, then it makes you think about the law and the common law, and that makes you think about the Constitution. So whilst I'm absolutely not arguing that there's a sort of rising bourgeoisie or even a rising rural middling sort who then knocking on the corridors of power and become the kernels of the parliamentarian war effort, I'm absolutely not arguing that. What I am saying is that this kind of spreading of sort of political and legal knowledge in this period, which then encourages people to have lots and lots of different opinions about God, about the Constitution, about neighborliness, and encourages lots of middling sort of people to become royalists and Tories, and lots of them to become parliamentarians and Whigs. It makes it changes the political landscape in really interesting ways. So I'm not dragging up the corpse of the bourgeois revolution, but what I am saying is that social structure is more politically important than perhaps some accounts, some post Christopher Hill accounts of the 17th century might allow.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back in, I suppose, circling back to where we started in a way, really, it's sort of one of the things I like is the fact that because you've taken a long look at this, it's kind of, rather than, again, the parceling up of individual periods, we tend to think, you know, we parcel people up. Well, you know, Cromwell, he's the 1640s and 1650s. Pepys, he's the 1660s, you know, whatever. Actually, these people spread over all of that period and they all overlap with each other. So, you know, as the thing we always point out to Cromwell, you know, to visitors, is that, you know, Cromwell's born in the Elizabethan period. As a schoolboy, Shakespeare is still writing plays at that time. You know, Mary Queen of Scots' body is carried through Huntingdon on the way south to London whilst Cromwell's a schoolboy here. You know, all of these people, you know, Pepys goes to the same school. They know each other. Pepys gets his first job working for Cromwell. They all kind of cross over. It all, you know, it isn't just a neat parceling up of the 17th century that people, I think, have done in historiography, both the popular imagination and academic historiography for too long a time, perhaps.
Yeah, I agree, and there's also these kind of really interesting ways that the past gets dredged up. I think there's still a bit of a view that in 1660 there's this sort of collective act of forgetting, and I think there are people who attempt that, but A, it's not very successful, and B, as soon as it becomes politically convenient. From the 1670s, really, the Civil War gets dragged up again, and you know, you look at some of the print propaganda during the exclusion crisis, and you've got people like Roger Lestrange, who's kind of wonderful, you know, kind of bumptious Tory propagandist, fascinating character, absolute sort of pathological hatred of anyone who deigns to disagree with him, and the way that he portrays the Whigs in that period is very much as the heirs of 1641, the heirs of Pym and the heirs of Cromwell. And if they get their way in the exclusion, then you'll have naked Adamites walking around London again, as you allegedly did in the 1650s. And so that memory of the conflict becomes a really powerful political tool in the later period as well. So yeah, I mean, there are all these connections, and I think one could criticize books which take the whole period as a whole, for kind of maybe sort of smoothing out some of these things and kind of trying to suggest that there are unifying themes across the whole century. But I think as a bit of a balance to, as you say, the kind of parceling of a lot of the scholarship and a lot of the popular text on this kind of thing, I think that is a useful thing to do. It is a century where it's basically kind of three generations, and between the first decade of the 17th century and the 1680s. So there is a lot of connection, I think.
In terms of this period as well, it also seems fascinating to me the number of remarkable women that are kind of coming out of this period. I mean, obviously you've regarded to Margaret Cavendish already. I mean, are there any others that sort of have piqued your interest, or sort of particularly you sort of found interesting or wanted to draw people's attention to?
Well, I mean, the Jane Thornborough, who is the person who starts the book, is a fascinating, if completely obscure, young gentlewoman who has a sort of quite sort of troubling relationship with the authorities in Lancashire. But the Quaker women as well. I mean, Margaret Fell, who she ends up writing to Cromwell to sort of beard him for not tolerating the Quakers enough. And she's again, it's that sort of it's the Furness Peninsula in Lancashire. Without her, the early Quaker movement would have really struggled. And one of the things about that kind of mid-century period is that you get much more opportunity for participation in the political sphere by women, and it's they are royalists, and they are parliamentarians. There's not a sort of neat there's not a kind of neat mapping onto political boundaries, but the Levellers, for example, they depended on women on street corners retailing their publications. The religious sects depended on female preachers and women who sort of organized the congregations. And there's these huge kind of women's marches in 1643, for example. Women as petitioners in London are a major kind of force on the political scene, not always to the taste of those in authority. There's a moment in 1649 where Leveller women come and sort of press at the doors of Parliament, and they're told by the MPs to sort of go home and meddle with your housewifery kind of thing, and
go home and do the washing up, basically, wasn't
it? Basically, yeah. So I mean, there's it is a period in which I mean, all periods of history are those in which women play a critical role, but here it's interesting because that role is becoming more political, and of course by the end of the century women don't have the vote. That kind of stuff is a long way in the future, but there are other forms of political participation, and in those women play a really fascinating and important role.
Final question before I let you go, which of course is going to be the inevitable one, bearing in mind where I'm asking for. So obviously you've written about Cromwell inside here. What's your take on him?
I honestly don't know. the more you...
don't worry, don't worry, because I have a very
no.
similar answer, so that's fine.
The more you read about the man, the less fathomable he becomes. And you know,
It's a paradox, isn't he?
he really is. You know, and me and Cromwell go back a long way. You know, I remember reading the Putney debates as a student, and you know, just sort of not really getting my head around him. I don't quite buy the view that he's just a sort of cynical Machiavellian. I think I think he's more he's slightly wetter behind the ears than that. I think there are some really interesting principles at play with Cromwell. And I think for him, he is someone for whom religion is much more important than anything else. You know, forms of constitution are but dross and dung in the face of Christ. I can't imagine John Pym saying that. You know, John Pym is a you know, a thundering Puritan. John Hampden, same. All these people, for them, for the majority of the parliamentarian cause, I think in the 1640s, issues of the constitution, issues of the law are very, very important. I don't always get the sense with Cromwell. And you know, the thing that I find most kind of ironic with Cromwell is, you know, and why he's quite a problem in my book, really, is that one of the things I put quite a lot of emphasis on is this idea of sovereignty, political sovereignty. Where does it come from? Maybe that's a reflection of the Brexit.
I was going to say, we're back to the Brexit book again, aren't we? Yeah.
It would appear so. We can't avoid it as much as I tried.
I was going to say, was there a 52%, 48% divide where you're worrying about that? Yeah.
Absolutely. But there's this whole question of sovereignty, and does it come from the people, or does it come from God? And Cromwell at Putney, he sort of says, yes, you know, power resides in the people, radically so. And yet, when he's offered the crown in 1657, this is an attempt by Parliament to finally settle that question and to give power to a monarch through an offer from the representatives of the people. And Cromwell turns it down. And he turns it down because God has gone against monarchy. So it's the same sort of argument that Charles I is using about God going, you know, in favor of monarchy, but now he's using it against it. So I think one thing about Cromwell is that he is quite singular, even amongst that sort of you know, that kind of parliamentarian cause. And I think he's probably, I don't know what your take on this, but I think he's probably much more at home with the sort of independent congregations than he is with the sort of, you know, the common lawyers. And I think that the problem is that actually the common lawyers are more reflective of where English society is in the middle of the 17th century than the independent congregations.
I kind of agree with that, yeah. And I think, you know, my takeaways on him is that sort of there are two sides in terms of his decision-making process. And he's almost like sitting on one shoulder, there is God's providence sitting there, you know, what's God's telling me to do? And the other one is there is a little pragmatic sort of character sitting there going, well, this is what, okay, that's all very well, but this is what's going to work.
Yeah,
so, you know, so I think, you know, with his decision-making process, he's always balancing those two things. So I think, you know, my take with him, you know, rejecting the crown, for example, yes, I think God's telling him not to reject it, but he also knows damn well that the army's probably not going to let him take it. So that's the pragmatic side to him as well. So it's both those things playing in his head.
Although I have to say, in one of my undergraduate essays, I made a very compelling case that he refused the crown because he didn't want the army to oppose him, and I got sort of shredded by my tutor, the late Clive Holmes, who, I mean, he's, you know, the late great Clive, yes,
yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was very generous about my essay, but he says, you know, great essay, but you're wrong.
I can imagine Clive being very strident about that. So yeah.
So he was very much in the Blair Worden camp, the you know, the sin of Achan kind of thing, which, you know, it's a brilliant article by Blair Worden And yeah, it was fascinating stuff.
It's nice. Jonathan, it's been an absolute delight, and it's a brilliant book, which I'm working my way through at the moment and thoroughly enjoying it. And thank you very much for giving us some time this afternoon to have a chat about it. And please, for anybody who's out there, do recommend it. Copy of The Blazing World, Jonathan Healey, available from all good bookshops. Although I have to say, in London, actually on Saturday, I had quite a job actually finding a copy of it because it's obviously selling so well at the moment. So, but thank you very much indeed.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found that interesting. Please do remember to like and subscribe to our, this video and to our YouTube channel. Do keep your eyes open for our other videos, and if you've not watched some of them before, please do dip in and find out about other aspects of our period. Please remember also to follow us on our various social media channels, and we hope to see you again for our next video sometime soon. Thank you.